In linguistics or rhetoric. There's a lot of very interesting material on questions that I have at home and copies that I can bring in, or people are interested. I didn't do that because at the beginning because I didn't know what people's background, but there are a lot of very more technical questions on the structure of a question, the rhetoric of questions, things that appear in more technical linguistic or historical linguistic things. So if that's an interest of yours, let me know. And if there's a number of people, we can put that on chalk. Otherwise, I'll just bring in some copies that people can circulate around. Okay? I thought I will be working off both the Hebrew and the translation. So if you have one or both, and I'm going to be using, just as a double check, because I don't normally use it, the New English Bible, as well as a very lovely translation, the Book of Job by Raymond Shendlin, which was done a number of years ago. He's mostly known for his work in medieval Hebrew poetry, but this is an extraordinary translation with notes. I didn't assign it directly because in some cases the Jewish Publication Society and others are a little bit more literal, so you get a clear sense of the question. And in some cases, Shenlin's translation is a little bit more paraphrastic and softens the multiplicity of the questions, really for stylistic purposes. But this is excellent, and it's the entire text. The only other literary rendition of Job that's worth looking at from a stylistic point of view is the translation of the Voice of Job that was done by Stephen Mitchell, but it's a little bit more complicated because it's much more gapped in terms of the chapters that he chooses, and then you can't always tell whether he's basing himself on which tradition. So, for example, the Jewish Publication Society purports to be the Masoretic text and its translation, but whenever they have a problem, they did what the King James translation does. They use medieval Jewish commentaries, and they smuggle that in as if that was the plain sense of the text. So the translation is not always the Masoretic text. It may be the Masoretic text through the filter of medieval commentaries. The same problem, or from a different side, comes through the New English Bible, which is done by the Church of England, but you have the same problem with the RSV that were done by the Protestant churches in the United States, whereas because in the Christian community the Septuagint, or the Greek translation, is the normative sacred text, whenever there is a problem, and there are many problems in the book of Job that and the Greek represents a very different text, they silently translate in the light of the Septuagint. So you're not always simply getting a translation. Overall, particularly with biblical materials, I very strongly recommend that you, if you're using the material in English, at least, that you read a translation that you're not comfortable with. When Buber did one of his Bible translations in terms of one of the introductions, he spoke about not only the need to read slowly, but he spoke of the leprosy of fluency. So the leprosy of fluency is when you sort of think you know what's going to be coming up. It's a much larger philosophical principle, right? But you sort of read faster with your eyes, or you integrate something because you think you know what the content is. So you do what psychologists call, you subitize. You kind of make a kind of a global intuition about what the totality of the meaning is, but you're not reading the words and stop and hesitate precisely where you have to. And we're going to see that that's going to be quite an important issue in terms of what the questions are and how the questions are detailed. But I think for me that's a fundamental principle of reading, of the slowing down, but also protecting oneself against this leprosy of fluency, so that you don't read with your eyes or with your prior knowledge, but you read in terms of what's coming over against you, what Buber called the Gegenüber, that thing that confronts you, then you have to deal with that. And that's as much a principle of reading as well as reading well with competence. So there's a different level of being brought into a reading matter. I'm going to talk about that in a second about Joe, but let me just make a few brief summary comments about some of the things we dealt with last time, just to kind of bring ourselves back all on the same mental page. And then if you wish to actually bring up anything that occurred in the reading or something that came up from last time, that would be a good time to do it before we move on. So last time, both in general and with respect to certain particular texts, we spoke about the question and the mode of questioning in a twofold manner. The questions are both mode of questioning, which would then be the rhetoric of the question. How is a question posed? How is a question structured? How does it work? That was to say, what are the stylistics of a question? Where does it appear in a narrative or in a dialogue? What are the semantics? We'll see today a whole variety of threefold rhetorical questions, which kind of delay the pace and the punch of the question, right? In other words, that would be a certain type of modality of the rhetoric, the nature and the dynamic of the context. Does it come as a surprise? Does it come as something expected? Does it demand an immediate answer? So there is the mode of the question from a rhetorical or stylistic point of view, but the mode of questioning is also a more philosophical issue. It's a mode of being. So it's a mode of how do you ask a question, and the mode of being. That is to say, how do you engage the world from the position of query? There's a very, if you're interested in this issue from a philosophical point of view, there was a philosopher who taught in Columbia in the early 60s and 70s. He's not well known now, but in those days there was a very important movement of American philosophical naturalism at Columbia. That were taking up parts of the tradition that first circulated in Chicago here with John Dewey, the notion of experience and so on. And his name is Justice Buchler, B-U-C-H-L-E-R. And he has a particular interesting book called Nature and Spirit. And one of the major philosophical chapters is called Query. In other words, it's how do you stand in the world in this open-ended way, that you are posing questions, that you are in this as a modus, not if the first is a modus operandi, the second is a modus vivendi, right? That you're in the world in an open-ended way and things are moving out towards you. From the flip side of that, and I think I alluded to it last time, the final work of Merleau-Ponty, particularly his work on the visible and the invisible, speaks also of the question in relationship to the self, but being questioned by the world. In other words, it's not just that you are in the state of positing, but you are being posited. In other words, the world is already something there that requires an answer. Precisely when you're not seeing things. So there's this double side, the operandi and the vivendi. There is the positing of the question, and there's being posited, which means that one is subjected to something that comes from the outside. One is not simply imposing initially, but one is in a subjunctive or subjective or subordinate position. And then the question is, then you reciprocally ask, what was that questioned me? What does it mean? But Merleau-Ponty actually speaks a number of times in his, not only in his issues on perception, but also in his work, particularly on how the world comes to consciousness. So this sense of something is already there that puts me in question by the question that I'm forced to address. So how am I put into question by the world? How am I put into question by circumstances? That's part of this mode of being. And of course, Job is also going to be put into question. So that whole dialectic between the tree of wisdom and the tree of knowledge and the tree of life is immediately posed. You're put into question by the tree of life and the questions of life, and then how does knowledge begin to try to adjust itself to what is being imposed upon the self. Now, in addition, so that mode of being is how you're engaged with the world, how you are engaged or entwined with yourself, and then, of course, if the question is posed metaphysically or in terms of God questions, but also how do you stand vis-a-vis tradition? And I mean tradition in the fullest sense of all that comes down as prior normative material when something happens that puts that into question. So it's not religion in this sense we want to put into the larger notion of tradition, that one is born into oral tradition before you have the written tradition. You have an oral Torah, as it were, before you have a written Torah. You are spoken to and you have norms that come in the family. Before you, they're already given oral way of living and speaking. Then there are these ruptures that take you out of that and require one to kind of grow through questions and the like. So from this second point of view that we talked about a little last time, a space is opened up in the self. In other words, when a question is posed to the self, or the self poses a question, there is a space that's opened up between the self and the world. And there's a space, we see we're anticipating the Job, but more broadly, but then there's a space that's opened up in the mind. I didn't know what I thought I knew. Or something has been problemated and it opens up a space of questioning. So that makes me, and I submit to that question, but a new space is opened up. If one is more actively involved and not thinking reflectively, the question opens up a space that then has to be filled. And so that in that sense, that's the answer that requires new questions and so on as an ongoing mode of being. And we juxtaposed that, just to remind you last time, and we saw that Gadamer uses the Socratic question, but for his own purposes. The Socratic question, from our point of view, is the ironic question because it poses a question which knows the answer. It's trying to lead you in a certain direction. Gadamer used that in a softer sense because he said that is a kind of a classical model of questioning because it opens up the notion of life as conversation, to have a dialogue partner, or what Gadamer called a conversation partner. So a conversation partner is a person who's involved in that questioning and answering into our relationship. So in some cases, that opening is because of a knot that one faces that has to be done, or it's an ambiguity, or it's a fundamental rupture into the way we thought things were supposed to be. And then the answer takes place in that context. So it tries to resolve, in a certain sense, the question poses something that wants to be resolved, right? And the living within the question means that the question can never be finally resolved. It's a kind of telos of the final issue, but it puts one into the fundamental mode of not only subject in the world, as opposed to subjecting something but being subjected, which is a fundamental mode of being in the question, but it also opens up this larger notion of gnosis or ignorance, right? To this modality, what is known and how is it known? So the method of answering the question may answer one particular question, but it may not answer the more fundamental question, right? So the method of how one construes the world from a scientific or a pragmatic point of view may be a certain construal of an answer, but it doesn't answer the more fundamental questions of life balance in a deeper sense. And this is all anticipating where we're going to go with the Job business. Now, before we get to Job, there's one other transitional piece that I think is important to deal with, and that is questions that appear in the context of a text, right? So they're not initially your question, but you have been brought into the question through the narrative frame of a text. From yourself into narrative, you are brought into its own mode of narration, into its own mode of positing life, into its own presumptive structure of what exists. Within the framework of a narrative, we, in a certain sense, bracket or suspend the fictive quality of it. In other words, if you enter into a narrative, it becomes a real world. You're not saying to yourself, oh, this is a work of the imagination. But in fact, that imaginative world becomes a real world. In fact, certain philosophers of the notion of imagination actually counterpoint imagination with the issue of pain. And I mention this precisely because pain and how you think about pain is the issue also with Job. And some philosophers have said, well, pain as such doesn't have an object. It is the reality itself. In the same way, imagination, when one is engaged in imagination, one is not always saying, I'm imagining this, or this is a work of the imagination. If the fictive or the frame structure of a text is working, one enters into it. Now, obviously, if you bring a certain cognitive set to that, you're going to be constantly saying, well, the world doesn't work that way. Genesis 1 is not that way. I know from science, blah, 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 blah. Or you could enter that world from the sense of recours as a second naivete. Let's say, I suspend my first order sense of reality for the sake of this second order reality, which I take as a first order reality, to see what the truth is that's being presented to me. So that second naivete is a kind of Husserlian bracketing in a certain sense, right? In other words, I say, I am a different person, but I'm going to suspend my judgment of that fictive or religious particular world to understand how that world works in its own truth sense, how it is going to begin to unfold. So that becomes the framing that is so fundamentally important. So beyond the questions that would arise from what we would say, the French would say the explication du texte, the explication of a text, there is how the text comprises a ritual space. So the reading as a kind of ritual event in which one enters the language so that that language becomes a narrative truth of its own. There may be reasons why you would rupture, that would be ruptured. Why is that important? Because, as we will see, the questions may not be your initial questions, but the narrative requires one to enter in, to make those questions your own during the space of the reading, right? And then the question would be, do those become living questions? That will be a crucial issue with Job. We may, one of us, maybe around the table, may live a blessed life, and you sort of enter into Job with all the naivete of a child. But the question is, if those questions are real, how are they appropriated and transformed into one's own reality? So the questions may not be your first order questions, but they become a question to stay with the truth of the narrative. And that's why reading a theological work like the book of Job is so crucial in that way, right? It is doing for us what it was also doing for the culture. It's trying to take you out of a certain standpoint, a certain mentality, a certain kind of complacency, a certain way of construing what it means to be a religious self, and bringing you into that. And the reason why the book of Job is so particularly powerful, even for us as moderns, is that it's a thoroughly fictive work, right? It's not presented as a divine revelation. Even the revelation is presented as a narrative structure within the text. It's not so that one sees this within the context of wisdom literature, that it's the struggle of the natural mind to construe the world, even through narrative. Yes?
I think I misunderstood what you said about ritual questions and...
I said reading is a ritual process. I would say in the sense that one enters the language as a kind of, maybe we shouldn't talk about ritual or liturgical, but what I wanted to try to get at is that it's not the normal way of speaking. It's not the normal way of just, let's say, reading a newspaper, let us say. What it does is it says that this is a prior sequence of language that I commit myself to, and I recite it to move ritually through that language towards where it's going. Now, of course, there's a whole spectrum from small-scale literature to what might be religiously challenging material. Does that category, can you see why I used it? I'm trying to get more at the ritual character of reading. And then certain kinds of readings are trying to kind of engage the self in a space out of, or time out of time in a certain way. So I was using that more in that ritual or liturgical sense, but I'm using it more metaphorically. Is that okay? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, see?
By saying this is ritual, you mean basically that one engages the text as if it's actually a language or like in a linguistic manner?
Yeah, as if it's a
language. I mean, trying to kind of engage.
If you wanted to say it's like, in other words, it's not to you in the sense that we've been talking about with Gadamer or Ricoeur. It's not everyday language. It's literary language. So in other words, it's a preformed structure that I then enter into, and my intentions and process of reading are part of that construal of sense. Yes, it's not everyday language. It's not normal language. It may use that, but it is a literary event, and that when I start, right, once upon a time, it tells me I have to enter a different frame. Or there was a man in the land of Uz, and his name was Job.
And basically, my more particular question was whether, language in the philosophical sense, if you describe language in terms of a dialogue, in terms of questioning. So in that sense, if we are to juxtapose text and languages, the latter being the question and the dialogue, bringing things into question, and the text as being the fixed kind of structure, so the ritual being...
And its questions bring us into question, or bring our cognition into it. Yes? Did you have?
No, please.
Please.
I'm still formulating it now that we're honoring questions so much. But I think, I'm not sure if what we're saying about the text is that it will lead our questioning, where the questions already exist and it only opens our eyes to this question, or the fact that the very literary language is something that we accept as the fictive world that we're accepting, and now we're stepping into a different kind of mode of questioning.
It's not one or the other. It's dialogical, right? It's dialogical. In other words, the text. The text poses issues to me, its own questions and its own reality. I respond and ask questions, and the text is this unfolding of its meaning that way. From that point of view, if you're in, I wasn't going to go this way, but just to bring this in, are you familiar with the German literary critic of Wolfgang Isser? So he actually, many years ago, ISER. So he actually raised a very interesting question that's pertaining to what we're talking about, text and reading. He said, it's a simple question, but he answered it in an unusual way. So he said, where is the meaning of the text? What is the meaning of the text? And he says that the meaning of the text is not at the end point. The meaning of the text is at every stage of the process of reading, so that one is constantly hermeneutically revising where the text is going, or what the character is, or what the assumption is, at every single point. The meaning of the text is the conglomerate and the total, or the totality of the unfolding meanings, including the doubts that are going on. Anyway, I raised that in that question to answer your question, to see this dialogically in the sense of the reciprocity of there's more questions in the text precisely because you are the reader and I'm a different reader and so on. Yeah.
So despite the fact that the question process in the textual context happens within the text and between the reader and the text, it still opens an ontological space which back again raises questions of relationship. One's being versus there's a new ontological space open.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes.
And so in that sense,
it's because it's a different world.
Right.
It's a different world.
So,
the ontology of what it means to be in that space changes you as a person. You're in a different
and so it's not
reality.
Mere text.
What?
And so it's not mere text.
It's not mere text. No, it's world. It's world. Text as world, right? And that's one of the reasons, certainly, why Ricoeur would talk about using the model of a text as a world, right? Because it deals with action, it deals with speech, it deals with this particularly framed universe, it deals with the need for conversation and clarification, and so on and so forth. In other words, what is the paradigm for thinking about life? Can you use a text as a paradigm? That's a different order of questions, but that's related. I would ask one more thing, and then we're going to go to the book of Job, and that is that what the issue of questions will do, particularly in the book of Job, and in a kind of work like that, which is reflective in terms of religious and philosophical questions, is that it doesn't allow the question or the problem to be abstract and rational. They become concrete and personal. If you're in the realm of questioning, let us say not in the abstract sense of Aristotle's question but which may in some cases be rhetorical or ask a certain kind of structural question, but if it's a question that is being posed between person and person and that emerges through the dialogue between characters, as we'll see in the book of Job, it means that the questions are heard and experienced as a concrete event, face to face. So they have the fictive of being very real, even if it's between God and the Satan. These are real interactive moments. We don't say, well, this is just out there as an abstract issue. The question then requires the concreteness of the other or what's being addressed, or if it's in the world, there's a directness. The world, if we say the world speaks to me or asks of this of me, or what is being asked of me, this becomes a personalization of living in the world, not just an abstraction. And I think that's it's a key issue, as we'll see in our text. Yeah. Well, I think that would be a very interesting thing, even to do as a paper. If that's an interesting thing. No one has ever really worked out, which is, I think, is a very interesting question, let us say, the difference between, and we'll see when we deal with the rabbinic sources, particularly the Talmud, right? What is the relationship between one person and another as they ask questions as an interlocutor, as opposed to two people or three people, or a group of people in a Platonic dialogue, right? So it asks the question of what is the space of questions, what is the telos, or the end of a question. It even asks a much more fundamental question: what is the nature of friendship in questions? Like, do you want to help? How is a question trying to help? Are you helping the abstract question, or are you helping the person? Right? And those work quite differently if you're in a Platonic dialogue or if you're in a rabbinic text. Those kind of phenomenological issues are fundamental, right? Is the agonistic or the struggle issue for the sake of a meta-truth, God's truth, let us say, if you're, right? So I can, we can go back and forth, but it's what the rabbis would say, it's l'shem shamayim. We're doing it for a meta-sense, even though the Talmud is filled with highly aggressive interpersonal relations, which are hardly for the sake of heaven, right? Whereas the notion of hard questioning from the notion of agon, or the agonistic issue in the Greek world, is that friendship is predicated on pushing another person farther. It's not just saying, you're right and I'm right, you're okay, I'm okay, and let's move on. But it's on this notion that we're trying to get to a truth. And we want to be wise, let us say. So I need you to push me, and I trust your friendship insofar as I trust the fact that it's working towards that, right? If it's simply to undermine me as a person or to cheapen me and things like that, then it's not working in terms of that notion of friendship. But the question would always be, what is at stake when people are posing one thing to another, right? And what would be the precondition of trust, right? So the precondition of trust in a rabbinic context, which we'll have a lot more to talk about, would be the safe or the holy space of a study circle for the sake of knowing divine will or approximating of the divine will, right? And the space in a philosophical academy would be the presumed space that you enter that at your risk because you're willing to have your presuppositions challenged, right? And that becomes a very different kind of trust, that I trust the teacher who is not just unmanning me as a person because he's more clever, but because he wants to lead me to a new way of me positing truth on my own, right? So maybe when we get to these questions in the rabbinic sources, we can do that, but that would be a very important issue, just like it would be we don't even have questions like, what if you pose the questions in rabbinic, midrashic study circles over against the way the church fathers are asking questions? Or the whole notion in the medieval world, it was a very common in the medieval world, and the rabbi and the medieval Jewish commentators took it over from the Christians, what's called the questiones. That is, you begin a book by asking a series of questions, and then that's part of your introduction. And a comparative notion of the questiones would be extremely interesting because they also represent different structures of mind. But let's ask, and a couple more things, then I think we should get to Mr. Job here. He's languishing. Anybody else? I don't want to stop anything, but I just want to
follow up on Benny's question. I think, okay. With regard to Job and say, for example, Socratic dialogues or symposium, for example, I think a key element will be to be examined is the relation between the dynamics between the question and the opening question. So obviously the relation between the Socratics and the companions with regard to the role of question will be fundamentally different vis-a-vis.
What is a real question? That would be.
And who asks?
Okay.
Who is being asked? Who asks? And what's the role and dynamics between the questioner and the one who questions? And the Socratic dialogues vis-a-vis, for example, Job, where it would seem from, that there's something fundamentally different with regard to structure of questioning, regardless of content, regardless the.
Yes, but I think you have to differentiate between the objective of dialogue.
A little louder so everybody can hear. Yeah.
There's a need, I think, to differentiate between the objective of a given dialogue, and of course it goes without saying that you have different objectives. But I'm talking about the dynamics between the interlocutors, and I think that's
Yes, right. Well, don't forget. I think an interesting thing, and we'll have to ask this question maybe about the Job's question, but it's a much larger question. When an interlocutor interrupts a chain of thought, right? The notion of interruption, to ask, have you considered X? Or is this there's something, can I ask the question that you haven't thought of asking? Or can I push you to open up a question that would move you further? So this notion of interlocutor is not just the person I'm in a vis-a-vis questioning with, but that interrupts a prior mental conversation or prior assumption of things too. Do you allow that person to break in and ask? Yeah.
Sorry.
Please, there's no sorry.
Originally, it seemed like you were suggesting that the form of the questions, whether it's dialogical or abstract, dictates the character of, or the sort of response that's demanded from the question. Like, must it be concrete and personal, or must it be sort of like rational? But then you seem to suggest, and there you were contrasting like Job with Aristotle. I think that's why I said that. But then it seemed like you were saying that not the form of the question dictates the character, but like the theological or ethical presuppositions of the questioner. So are you saying that both can dictate the form of the answer, or because it doesn't seem like they necessarily
So why don't you answer
go
your
on.
question? So it's not a rhetorical question.
Oh.
Well, how would you answer it? In what way would they be separate? In what way could you bring them together? Would they be both necessary?
I mean, they're separate. If you, or an example in which they're separate seemed to be the one that Benny was raising of people in a Greek symposium or something, in which case you would not have the same like ethical or theological presuppositions as the rabbis in the Talmudic
But you could have
period.
different presuppositions. In other words, one person say, I really know the truth, right?
Between the different people in a given context.
Mm-hmm. Right. Wouldn't that be part of the problem in the symposium? The presupposition that my world is closed, and the questioner says, no, the world is more open.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense.
So it's not necessarily across cultures; it could be within a culture too.
Sure.
It's the issue of being open or closed.
Okay.
Right?
But there's no saying that like just simply because it's a dialogical form that here's I suppose what I'm getting at. It's not necessary to say, oh, because the form is dialogical, and it's not just Aristotle monologuing in the metaphysics that it has to be like a concrete and personal response. You could have abstract, rational, if you want to use those adjectives, responses in a dialogical
Well, then
format.
you have to assume that when you read Aristotle and he's giving you his notes or the notes that he got from Plato or whatever he's doing, that you're reading that as an active challenge to you. In other words, you've entered into this space in a new way. And that would relate us to this issue of entering into that book. So in other words, entering different kinds of books would make Aristotle a teacher. That means he's posing something.
Sure.
Okay? Once you allow him to be a teacher to pose, you are being addressed. And that address is calling you into question from the you that preceded the reading.
Sure.
It doesn't necessarily call everything into
No,
question,
that's fine.
but it
Yeah.
calls, I am ready to hear what's being addressed to me.
Sure.
You
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
know. Okay. So let's maybe turn to Job, and we're going to start a little bit. Let me get your text that you feel comfortable with. I want to just kind of refer back to Chandler, but I'm going to kind of be translating as we go, but I want you to be looking at the text, and we have to kind of move back and forth. Okay? So the beginning of this issue, obviously when we enter into the text sets up the larger presuppositions of the notion, right? First of all, there was a person, and the person is not in a Israelite or Jewish space. The person is in a universal space. he and his friends are not Jewish, even though the questions will be Israelite questions, but it becomes a universal question. So the land of Uz is somewhere else, the land of Oz, so it's probably in Omaha, right? Definitely in Omaha, but it could be someplace else. Already his name becomes a puzzle, right? Is he an oyev? Is he already an antagonist? What does his name mean already as Eov? But the issue, then the presupposition of the text, the setting, is the Hebrew, he is tam v'yashar. So there's some kind of integrity or wholeness and straightforwardness. Having, presumably, we don't know whether that has a moral or theological quality about it. Then there is so that is a kind of hendiades, he's that, tam v'yashar, some form of integral person that seems to deal with his inner being. I would say there's a presupposition that his inner being, which is going to be challenged. Can you be tam and still whole, simple, and still serve God chinam with no expectation? So the way I'm reading it is the presupposition is threefold. There's a first presupposition to be tam v'yashar. So how does your translation read? He be simple or whole or innocent perhaps, and upright. Here he says innocent, upright, whatever that means. But that would be an inner character. That's an inner character. He is Yirei Elohim, which would mean a structure not just in relationship to himself, but in relationship to the mystery of existence. He is in a state of reverence. So it's not only in relationship to himself, there is some kind of a balance. Right? In relationship to God, there is a sense of reverential awe. Right? And then he is also sar meira. That is to say, that's an ethical quality. It's interesting, it's not that he's tov, good, and swerves from evil, but he doesn't do evil. He turns away from evil, right? He's not. It's an action that's not necessarily that he's doing the good, but he's not doing the bad, right? So maybe it's the Hippocratic oath, not to do harm, right? So he's the first person of the Hippocratic oath, do no harm, right? That's as the essential ethical principle, right? No harm, right? So that's a very important thing. So we can see there's a tripartite structure of the self, right? The self internally, in relationship to Job's self. This is the presupposition of the text, right? Because it's going to ask a more fundamental new question. The self in relationship to the mystery of existence, a sense of reverential awe, whatever yirah means, a sense of the numinous, a sense of the awesome. And then there's a sense that he does not strengthen evil. Right? He doesn't strengthen that. He doesn't engage it. Now, then there is a description of who he is in terms of his obsessive behavior, of his ritual behavior, and his deep concern, even that members of his family may have sinned in their own mind. So this is part of what he wants other people to be as tam and yashar as he is. In other words, he wants them to kind of do it the right way. So even if his kids were good, upstanding performers of the ritual, they may not have had the right attitude. So he's going to do it again. Right? He's going to be a helicopter ritualist, and he's going to make sure that they do it. Why is it so? That's already the question. How is the character implicated in the children? Because he won't be able to separate from his children, right? If his children suffer or die, and he suffers, he doesn't see those as two separate things, but he sees that he's being punished for their suffering, that as if he didn't close that gap sufficiently, right? So there's already implied here a certain style of personhood who is ritually obsessive, but not in terms of the punctiliousness of the action, but in terms of what the attitude was towards it. So it's already anticipating the question is going to be asked about interiority. Already the question of interiority is posed without being asked as a question, right? That there's a new notion of, this text has emerged in the biblical canon when a notion of subjectivity and reflection on selfhood and motive is now being brought into the mix. It's not just the formal behavior. The book is already raising the fundamental issue of motive and the purity of motive. So now, the first real question that's posed begins already in verse 5. So the first, we have this scene, a scene in heaven. Now, get this into your head. Job has no knowledge of what's going on in heaven. The whole theological scene in heaven is unknown. His life is put into question by events and experiences on earth. And he tries to resolve them not only as earthly questions, but hypothetical theological questions. But the narrative fiction is already to raise the irony. He doesn't have the clue of what's really going on in existence. Theology, in that sense, is beyond the answer of a human being already implied from the very beginning. He doesn't know the theology of this test or whether he was acknowledged as good. Right? He doesn't know that. Theology is going to be his construction of how things have been passed down in the tradition, what he's expecting, but it's not the truth. It's the truth, as we'll see both of his friends. Eliphaz will say, Charkanuha, we've examined it. It's a traditional thing. Right? And as we've gathered up a lot of empirical evidence. So it seems to work that way. And then we'll see, so that Bildad will also raise the question. This is the way it was in Dorot Rishonim, the kind of earlier days. Now, we have not, so in other words, in a certain sense, theology becomes a kind of empirical thing based on the tradition, but not based on the truth. The truth is already put in question, right? But he doesn't know that. Okay, so now, the first real question, I can see we're never going to get through this today, but we're going to work at it. Okay, anyway, but the first real question is on in verse 5, the end of verse 5, right? So Job is going around, and Job asks the question, Ulai chata'u vanai. Perhaps they sinned. So that was that question, right? That he's asking, that they were sinning and perhaps cursed God, bilvavam. But right, that term of using blessing as curse as a euphemism is already there. It'll appear. His wife will use that. But the point is bilvavam, in their hearts, right? In other words, that the intention is not pure, and Job would do this all the time. So that was his psychological structure. He was guessing that's the force of the ulai, right? So the whole notion of what kind of a person he is pivoted on the question. Perhaps the presupposition that they didn't have good intention, right? And so then he does that. And then immediately after that, we have the next series of questions where there's an event going on in the heavenly court, and God then sees the Satan, who is like the like the theological police. He's going around to check on everybody's behavior and bring a report back to heaven. And then God says, "Where have you come from?" Right? Me'ayin tavo. And then the Satan. So the question, the opening thing is, and then the next question is the divine question: have you seen have you put your libcha, right? So it's again, this focus on the mind, on the lay, just like it was on, right? So the questions are now interlocking questions, right? They become more intensified. Have you put your thought or your mind or your heart on Job? And then God says he's a superhero. He's the super religious kind of a guy. There's no one like him. And now the new third real question that is going to drive the book is hachinam. Right? Again, the whole issue is 3 times been this issue of motivation. Does a person serve the good or God or the truth gratuitously? Right? So from a different point of view, this is the Euthyphro's question, right? Is the good because it's good, or is the good because the God has said it's good? Right? What is youth? It's in Euthyphro. It's Plato's. Right. So the question is, why do you do hachinam? Will a person fear God for no? So we're meant to understand that this issue of his religious behavior is based on the sense of being awe and reverential care. So this new question opens up a new space of the subjectivity of the self, which becomes the most fundamental question of the whole book. Right? Job will claim that he did serve in a pure way, and the question of the Satan, which becomes the question, the cultural question, the antagonistic question, is: can a person serve without any self-interest? Right? Just the action without any expectation becomes the issue, and then the dialogue goes on. We don't have to repeat it. Where God says, "Well, he's not put to the test because everything is good." Sachta va'ado, right? He's got a Gardal shield around him, like nothing has ever happened to him. So since nothing's ever happened to him, you don't know what the deeper motivations of the self are going to be. So that becomes the deep question that's going to propel the book. Are there circumstances that throw the religious self off track? Because there was an assumption of coherence or relationship of some kind. In other words, the reward would mean, in this sense, that life would continue in a certain kind of a way. So in other words, you have the deep assumption here of what Berger would talk about in the sociology of knowledge, the sacred canopy. You construct a religious universe, and because you've constructed a religious universe of orderly rituals, you assume that the world works in the same orderly way, like that there is a homology between the orderliness of the ritual of my life and the order of consequences in the world. So then we're going to have this juxtaposition between the orders of ritual and the attempt to keep that as a closed system, right? No bad thoughts, and the notion of what would appear to him to be happenstance, but which in fact is a test because of a different sort.
Just going back to the first question, do you see a lack of correlation between the actual question and the answer, or the way we respond to the question? The question itself is about the inner interrogative subjectivity of the son. The way he answered the confronting question is by a ritualistic kind of normative kind of routine.
Right. His assumption, we see from the Satan's question that he's asking a psychological religious question, which we are going to come to realize is an odd question. In other words, because I live an orderly ritual life and everything has coherence, does that mean that the world itself has the same coherence, right? And is there a relationship between the one and the other? So there's a presumption of a correlation. And Job is also going to have to break out of that mentality. The shift in his mind to the very end will mean that he has to decenter his consciousness from the assumption that the things that he did in an orderly way have an impact on the orderliness of existence. Right?
But his answer for this question is it doesn't match the type of question.
Absolutely. Right?
Which is exactly the break.
Over and over again, we're going to see these breaks between question and answer, and I think that needs to be brought out to see how things are. There's never a fit between the question and the assumption, and that is already raised by the setting of what goes on in heaven goes on earth, right? So the book is raising the most fundamental notions of what it means to think that the world has order, or to live a ritual life with order, as if then that is a presumption that everything should have that notion, and that ritual is in a sense a miniature recapitulation of divine order and structure. Right? So I'm asking the question in a deeper sense than possibly part of what motivated the writer of the book of Job, who had read the book of Deuteronomy, right? Im shemoah tishmat mitzvotai. If you listen to my commandments, it'll be good. If you don't, it won't be so good. But that's also this assumption that ritual behavior keeps things orderly. But he's asking this at a deeper psycho-spiritual level. It's at the deepest possible level of, not in the Freudian sense that all rituals are obsessive compulsive, but you have a presumption that the world mirrors my assumption that I can bring things under control. So Job is trying to bring things under psychic control, and then we have the absurdity. We don't know that God has done this, right, or allowed this. But then the absurdity of what seems to be meaningless random events. So it's the random versus the order, and that's raised by the questions of the text, both explicitly and implicitly. I would just, before we, let's just jump to the end of the text, where we see that the first response of Job, he won't be like the second one, which was a question, but it's a kind of liturgical refrain, right? So read verse 21. How does that go? What does he say? In the English, if you want. Anybody?
Just read it out loud.
Yeah. Right.
Oh, okay. And he said, naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord.
Okay. So that's the answer to tragedy. The tragedy has called his life into question, right? Absolute randomness. And what is the answer to the question of absolute randomness? What is his answer? It's a liturgical answer, right? All he can do is he's mouthing piety. We have to assume that he believes it. And it says that lonatan tifla. So nothing bad came out of his mouth, even in his heart, presumably. There was nothing bad. So what is the answer to the most fundamental question of random disaster for the self?
It's God's will.
Is that it?
There is no.
Well, is he saying anything about God's will in the sense God is given and taken? But can you step one existential step behind that?
He's not willing to take this as a question.
What is?
He's not willing to use this to pose it as a question upon himself.
No, I think it's just saying that there's no injustice here because in terms of nothing was taken away from him, given that he had nothing to begin with. It's a very naive and.
Is it naive or is it very profound?
No, I think it's a first stage because afterwards.
In the book it is, but we don't know yet. In other words, at this stage, could that not be an extraordinarily profound statement? That is to say, no expectations.
But I think.
In other words, I am born mortal and frail, simply as flesh, born of a mother, because that's anticipating what he's going to talk about why was I born? And God has given it. In other words, I am, life is a gift, and it may end. I have no expectations. You know, that doesn't.
I agree with you.
Okay.
You have to read this in context with what's coming afterwards. And
Do we?
well,
Well, that's what I'm asking.
I
Can
think
you?
part of-
Well, if you stopped here, is this a naive or a profound question? If you just stopped here, 'cause you've just got to this point.
no, but without placing any adjectives on it, the point, I think, at least the rhetorical function of this question is to be contrasted with the repeated claims of why was I born, and that life itself is suffering. As of now, life itself doesn't have to be suffering.
So now you have raised, you've raised a fundamental hermeneutical problem. Do you have a right to do what you do? What you just did?
Do you have a right to
In other words,
read the-
when I get to chapter 3, I might fold that back into chapter 1. But if I'm trying to understand the force of the question and the answer at this point, why is that helping me understand this book? You know, how would I know that at this point?
Because I think it's obvious that this is not it's placed as part of a structure. It's like looking at just part of the structure. Even if you ignore the part, dialogue part.
So reformulate that as a hermeneutical problem. Whether I agree or not, but can you reformulate that so that the positive assertion becomes a question? In other words, that we're reading it as a question, but it's a statement, but it's more than a statement, right? Could you find a way to reformulate that so that the dialectic of question and answer is more profound? Possibly. That's what I'm asking. I'm not. Well, anybody want to try it?
I mean, I would say that the verb. Sorry, you were.
No.
I mean, there's obviously a much deeper question. I mean, so we ask whether or not we regard this kind of statement in kind of a profound kind of integrity on behalf of Job or not. And I would actually, I mean, the question was why would actually Job attempt to kind of prevent these kind of events to affect him, and to what motivates him in the first place?
Well, I'm trying to. I want to ask the philosophical question that's raised by the reading question. I agree with you. I'm trying to salvage your point, but still disagree with you.
But Job doesn't know what's coming. He all he knows is where he is.
So you're siding with the first part of it.
Fourth dimension of time, which we can't ignore.
Yes. All right. So from Maxim's Einsteinian point of view, time doesn't exist. So this
No, it
does.
does.
How does it exist and not exist at the same time?
It does, and
But it
We can't
exists in
ignore
this.
All right, he can't ignore time. So what I was going to suggest, and then I just want to hear the other issues. If we posed it so to kind of, we know that there's something else in the book because we're not just, we have a narrative, right? And we know there is something else. So then we might, then the question would be, Job has answered the question with an answer, but our narrator has provoked us into realizing that it's not over, right? Because he says, "B'chol zot," in any case, or up to this point, Job didn't sin and did not do that with his lips, as if there may be more to come. In other words, that embedded in the answer to the question of the randomness of existence, we're already made to feel that it is an answer but not the end of his answers, that something may come. In other words, we feel that as as a putative, as a possibility in the language. So in other words, what I'm trying to get at, and tell me whether you agree, because we're struggling to find a formulation. There's no people who talk this way. But what we're trying to say is, I don't want to agree with you to say, I know that yet he's going to have this problem in chapter 2 and chapter 3, because I haven't read that yet. But yet, I know that I am in the context of narrative, and I know that something has been said that doesn't seem to settle the issue by saying he didn't give tifla, as if, so why should you just say that? You know, there's something. Now, and in a certain sense, that pushes my anticipation of text a little bit further. Yeah, but do you want to come at this point? Because okay.
And it seems, I guess, to sort of support your point that it's difficult to imagine this outside of the context of somebody wrote this knowing full well what the outcome would be, and so at this point they're sort of setting something up. And your first response is, well, this is actually, he's got a pretty profound insight into this situation, but then the question could come up, or does he really? You know, because then
you're adding to this point. In other words, the notion of a narrator means that there's something perhaps more. The use of this language is setting us up, perhaps.
Yeah.
It's an implied question within the answer, possibly. Anybody else want to come in on this? So before we move forward. So then we have the text moves forward. And the next real question becomes a further way of underscoring the problematic. So we want to jump to verse 9 of chapter 2. And what does Mrs. Job say? Ishto, the she, what did the she say?
Do you still persist in your integrity? Curse
God and die. So all the key. So, right? So before this issue of Od. Odcha machazik betumatecha. Right? That's powerful. Right? Are you still going to hold, how long are you going, in other words, being innocent or being wholesome is not a virtue. It's an act of stupidity. Right? Because from her point of view, you know, there are limits to holding on to certain virtues. Right? The virtue of being tam and yashar, right, to be innocent or whole or have integrity, she's saying there's a limit to this. That you've reached a certain limit, so curse God and die, right? Because he said maybe the sons cursed God in their hearts, and so he said, just be done with it, right? In other words, if you do that, so there is already now an interesting assumption that's based on Job, because maybe in this universe of the text, to curse God and die means that God will zap him and he'll be dead. So that's presumably an assumption. But from a deeper psychological point of view, as moderns, right, there is something else involved here. For him to curse God means that he dies to his notion of reality, right? To die, he holds on to that notion because that's what gives him psychological life, right? To say, how long are you going to hold on to this, Barech Elohim vamut, curse God and die, means that he's saying to him, the assumption is that if you were to break with this vision of the world that you have, you will die. That is to say, your whole universe will collapse. And on the assumption that holding on to a certain cognitive vision is precisely what gives him life, even if there is a cognitive dissonance between the life that he's trying to live and reality, right? So you see, her question now is opening up a deeper set of spiritual and psychological issues. She's provoking him to beyond the limit. She's saying that holding on of this is now not an act of piety, but it seems to be an act of folly. But she's also implying to us, or at least implies to me as a reader, that unless we assume that God sends a shaft of lightning and Job dies, which could be an underlying assumption that the curse is punished, but there is also the deeper assumption that if you curse God, you will die in the deepest sense. And the person who holds on to even a false view, the machazik, the person who sustains that is also giving paradoxical evidence to having a certain life claim upon the world. Right?
Is it just your reading or is it based on some classic?
My reading. That's my reading. I'm proposing this as a modern person adding to that, David.
Well, in that sense, what Job says a few verses later on, he curses the day he was born, corresponds directly to what Job's wife actually argues.
Yeah, but
But he doesn't fall into the same pit. Like, he just wants to be fully annihilated.
he wants to be what?
Annihilated. Just, no.
Yeah, well, yeah. For him already, and that shift, as we'll see in chapter 3, is that life is just too much to bear. In other words, psychic pain is worse than the pain of the death. There's a correlation between psychic pain and physical pain. And for Job, psychic pain is the worst of punishments. Right? Did you want to say?
Yeah, I think maybe there's a distinction in my brain as in the way I see it, the difference between agency and self-ownership, or maybe ownership of life.
Oh, say more.
And while there is agency, so Job does choose his actions, and he chooses his ritualistic, he chooses piety, he chooses, but at the end, and what his wife says is, and I think this is also what he says in verse 21, which is, well, this is not mine to have. This was given to me, but it's not mine to have or to control. And I think that that's the distinction that maybe this is the question that needs to be answered, is what is agency and what is kind of ownership of
What do you mean?
life?
What do you mean? Spell out what you mean by emotional or religious ownership.
I think the kind of the right to life, the kind of death that Job will die if he curses God. That's the ownership that I'm referring to.
He has to own the consequences. Are you saying that? I think I understand what you're saying, but I want to make sure I understand. Are you saying he has to own the consequences of her provocation?
Yes. Well, so I think that he has to own the consequences of her provocation. That's agency. But in the, maybe I just misunderstood it. But in verse 21, let me just look at it one more time. It says, naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave me, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. So this is what I called ownership of life, of the things that are taken away, which he excuses because he says, this isn't mine. What is mine are the choices that I make and the actions that I have. I don't know.
Nice. That's very nice. That's very nice. We're going to have to see. You're attributing to him a very deep wisdom, and that wisdom, we'll see where that will play out. That's it, right? In other words, we'll see that will be an issue when we get to chapter 28, probably sometime next week. We may have to do 3 classes on Job. We'll have to see, because the types of questions are too important to let go. But I think that is a very nice distinction between myself as an agent and what I can let go of, right? I think that's going to be an interesting way to pose questions also about chapter 28, and it will come in a very different way by the end of the book. A certain kind of divestment. But let's take your point and just go to the very to verse 10, right after to what so the wife just provoked him, and he says, "You speak like a damn fool," right? You're just a damn fool.
Shameless woman.
Right? What?
Shameless woman.
Is that what the shameless woman? Nival. Okay. Anyway, you speak like a damn fool, right? Now here's the question, right? Shall we receive the good from God and not the evil? In any case, he didn't sin with his mouth. So what's going on here in relationship to this? It's a very, in other words, each key moment is a question issue, right? And it's asked of us, the reader, too. It's not just asked. Okay, yeah.
I think I'm going to use a little bit of anachronistic terms, but for pedagogy.
You go ahead. You're up.
The point here, I think, at least for the narrator, is pretty clearly to contrast a sort of consequentialist view of ethics presented by Job's wife, which claims that if you're not reaping any benefits from this, do away with it, as opposed to a sort of what you could call very anachronistically a deontological way of looking at God, ethics and or a relationship with the divine, which is presented by Job as saying should we accept only the good from God and not accept evil as a total commitment. That's at least again, I think this is
what would be all right, so let's spell this out a little. So consequentialist ethics would be, I have to see what the consequences of behavior is, and if it's not, let us say, beneficiary, it doesn't have a good and so on. It's really a pragmatic thing to, it should have certain benefits. Let's say, for the good of society, for the good of myself, But in this case, it has no benefit. Oh, what would an I have my own notion of what an ontological ethics are.
Deontological.
Huh?
Deontological.
Oh, you're saying a deontological ethics. So why don't you spell out what you are, so for those who need that, this, from a kind of post-Kantian deontological ethics. So what would you mean by that? Tell us what that would mean.
Put it very simply in duty ethics. Looking at whether it's belief or ethical action or whatever in terms of a duty that has to be carried out regardless of any consequences whatsoever. And I think, again, the wife, which is interesting in itself, why are females attributed this sort of thinking, but that's a different question, is representative of the pragmatic consequentialist view, which is ends whenever you don't reap the benefits, and Job is opposed to this. Is quoted for later on as a sort of a super Kantian who's sticking it up no matter what.
It's not Kantian because the reasoning which you get, first of all, because the reasoning which you get is not basically we must do it because we must do it, but rather we do receive the good and therefore we also need to receive the bad.
Say it again?
We do receive the good and therefore we also need to receive the bad. So it's also kind of trying to kind of speak with her in her
Yes,
own language.
I think C is sharpening the question, right? The question is, we receive the good and don't. So should we not also receive?
But it's not the ontological ethics. It's exactly the opposite in the sense I'm trying to kind of lay some. I'm trying to kind of emphasize the reason why I'm getting the bad, based on the fact that we do benefit from the good, and therefore there's some sort of opening of reasoning to say that.
So you should have consequential.
If it would be a Kantian, would say it's completely irrelevant. He wouldn't respond to her in her own language saying we receive the good, we benefit from the good, and hence I'm actually kind of inferring that we also need to receive the bad. He would just say we're doing it because he would say something like we think the bad is bad, but the bad is good itself, or we think that we make the differentiation between good and bad you speaking, your reasoning is basically based on empirical or kind of the
Consequentialist.
consequential,
Utilitarian is
kind of
a special case of consequentialism.
exactly, and therefore that's number one. Number two, and on the other aspect, and the other side, I don't see his wife speaking in a consequential kind of a notion of ethics. I mean, the way I read it is basically his wife saying something is not. I mean, existentially speaking, something is not right. Something is wrong. It's not about you not benefiting anymore, and therefore just curse God and die, but rather life in itself, the way you experience life, doesn't justify itself as life. Not in the sense that you're not enjoying life, but rather you're not living. There's something in the existential level which is not happening, which is not working out in the right manner, and therefore your own state, your current state kind of contradicts what you define as life.
I don't know if you understand this, but I've got two replies to that.
I replies to
I think you went a little bit beyond the good discussion.
Okay.
And you need to clarify. So the way you perceive life versus equals good, right? And the way you see life as no longer worth living as an evil.
No, that's the point. Something which transcends the distinction between good and evil. So it's not an ethical question.
No, I want to hear more. No,
it's not an ethical question.
But we might say that in both cases, the liturgical answer of Job in the first case and in the second case is beyond good and evil, and the difference is between the issue of the agency that we've been talking about. Right? In the first case, is God has given and has taken, right? So the agency is understood from God. God gives all kinds of things, and you have to kind of place yourself in the world, take ownership of no expectation. From this other side, if it's parallel but more intensified, is from the point of view of the human receiver. Right? We receive things, and he's not. His statement is, in a certain sense, I'm not making the assumption that everything that I receive is good as a consequence of what I did. I just receive, and I receive all kinds of things. Can I stand there and just be a receiver of the world, perhaps within the duty of ethics and keep up my behavior? But what he's saying is, how do I stand in the world? That would be more ontological ethics in that sense, that God gives and God takes. In other words, stuff happens, and in the second, and in that case, it forces me to realize my frailty as a creature of flesh. In the first case, in the second case, it means my whole presumption of the consequences of things is irrelevant. We get this and we get that. But we're talking about the Tov and the Ra from a human point of view, perhaps. In other words, what benefits us? And he's actually again making a different religious claim through the rhetorical question by saying that is the more profound stance. By asking it as a rhetorical question, namely, can you receive one thing and say, now I'm going to be a God, I'm going to praise God, and I won't say anything else, I'm going to curse God. He hasn't raised the question of the relationship between goods received and not received and his behavior. Right? In other words, in a certain sense, these questions are relevant from that larger question, can you serve God chinam? That was raising the question of expectation. And it's interesting that in these two answers of Job, he's not talking about the consequences of the implications. He's talking about two stances in the world, right? To be being given something that God is the giver of all things, or we are the receiver of all things. Right? And presumably, if the wife's statement that this is what it means to be tam or to have yirah. That is the stance of the higher religious self. In other words, and it's irrelevant of what I'm doing. In other words, what I'm doing may be based on rational ethics or maybe on divine commandment, but what's happening in the world is independent of what I do.
But there is a crucial thing here. He has agency, and there is a certain place in which he can decide, and he is more powerful than God, and is that he could have killed himself, and he's not doing this. And again,
but he will have a death. He will have a death wish. A super death wish.
Returning back to
he
But
has,
wish.
he doesn't do it, and it's critical.
No.
Throughout the book, he claims what was a point, but he never actually kills himself.
Sure, and
There's a reason for
the
this.
wife is in the position of the reader. I mean, she anticipates, and she's within the textual structure, right? We start with Job being this very pious man. The next verse is talking about his wealth and his personal joy, presumably as a consequence of him being all too very pious. His wife assumes exactly what the reader is to anticipate. And so she comes from this perspective. No one is talking about Job.
Right.
I mean, later on, Job is reflecting upon himself. But at this point, we're still the readers, and the wife is playing out as one of the participants
In your mind.
reading
Right.
Job.
And let's see, Rachel, one question, then maybe people want to take a kind of a 5-minute break? And then okay, so Rachel.
I don't know if this also speaks to the point you were making, but it seems to me if we take the first reading that you posited that Job's wife is challenging him to abandon his psychological reality, it seems that his the question that he offers as a response to her is very obstinate, and that he doesn't hear her challenge. But I don't know if that.
So say more. So but it's an obstinate question posed as a you damn fool, idiot. What? Right? You don't know. You don't know how men do it, right?
Sure. In saying.
Men hold on to their positions. Women are flexible.
So yeah, sort of. So if her challenge to him is, if you were to abandon, this mindset that governs and is necessary for your, psychological existence, whatever, and his retort to that is, should we accept only good from God and not accept evil? Something from within that psychological framework. It seems like he's obstinate to her having even addressed the question as a challenge.
And maybe the exact notion is the fact that she's trying to push him to take a position in the first place. I mean, maybe he doesn't have any ethical.
You're just a human being. Damn fool! I'm a theologian.
But that's the thing.
You're just responding to getting along. I'm a theologian. I keep my position.
It's like she's calling him a theologian, and he doesn't even have the self-consciousness to say, like, yes, I am a theologian. He just gives her a theological response without realizing what she's doing. But I don't know.
All right, one more thing, David.
Okay,
Let's take a little break.
it just occurred to me. Good is mentioned when Job retorts back to his wife. Evil is mentioned actually in the first verse. And so what we assume is actually good is just embedded within the 5 first verses of the text. And when we say that Job avoids evil, is it the same evil Job says that he
That's very interesting. That's very interesting. So from that point of view, to be sur mira, to depart from evil, means he doesn't want evil, bad consequences in his ritual.
Right.
He doesn't want to say any bad thing.
Right. But how does that correlate to the evil presumably occurring to him? Yeah. Which we assume.
This opens up a different question.
Which we assume is the opposite from the good, which we have no idea what that means.
To be sur mira means that I'm not gonna go there. I'm not gonna say the bad thing, right? It's a different kind of a way of construing his attribute. It's very nice. All right, let's take a little break. We're going to have to stop today at 5:30 because I have something at 6. But let's take 5 minutes now, and then we'll come back for 45 minutes. Okay. You feel good enough to give it to me? All right. Maybe you want to hold on. So, notice, just before we get to the questions, notice that when he does open his mouth, which is really telling what was really in his heart all along, because it said he hadn't yet Lonatan Tifla, he didn't speak, nothing came out of his mouth that was improper, or it said that Lo Chata Bisfatav, he didn't sin with his mouth, but we don't know what's going on in his mind all of this while. And all of a sudden, ba-boom, there's a limit to keeping your mouth shut. And perhaps his wife had realized that you can stay bottled up only so long, right? And at a certain point, her position and the psychic pain does burst out. It's interesting that he doesn't curse God. He never curses God at this point yet. Maybe he does later, but it's Vayekalel et Yomo. Right? He cursed his very existence. He cursed the other time, and of course it's ironical, because don't forget this was the Yom, Yamim Yamima, it's chapter 1, is that it was the cycle of ritual. Right? So there's a kind of ironic counterpoint between the annual ritual, Vehi Vayom, right? On that day. The rabbis understand that as Yom Kippur, that day, right? But the day of that annual ritual, over against his day, his existential, ontological, his ontic day, his day, which is his day, which means his existence, right? His very being. And that's part of what he wants to undo. The cursing his day curses the day of his birth. Cursing the very fact of being born, because being a born conscious creature is to have all of this pain. Right? So in a sense, by cursing, he wants to undo conscious birth existence, which means the pain of consciousness.
But Job was, if that's correct, was born literally after his sons and family have died, because he's been aware to the pain.
No, but would that I never had been born to have experienced anything like this. Right?
So what I have in mind is Adam and Eve being created, they're in a very subconscious awareness to their surroundings and existence, because they're just being given in the garden. After they eat the apple, they know Ben Tov Le'ra, in that sense. They know and they feel what is good and what is evil. And only after that, Adam has to work. Eve will suffer when she bears children.
Look, you could say that only after he allowed himself to fully experience the consequences of the death and his loss, and the psychic pain that he was going through, could he speak at this moment. In other words, he was protected before by ritual formulations, right? The two cases, Arom, or this case where he said, I was, Hatov Nikabel, we get the good. Those are ritual statements. So in a certain sense, he was prevented about thinking about the raw nature of existence by the epistemic or cognitive structure that had been inculcated into him as a ritual person, right? At a certain point. And this, I think there are two interesting points for this. It just occurs, I hadn't quite realized it this way, but it seems to me, or presented as a query, because this is more of a psychological issue, that at a certain point, it's not the argumentation that totally transforms him, but this period of gestation of the suffering, right? And that period of the gestation of the suffering is represented in the text by the silence of the friends who simply see the horror. In other words, the transition from his ritual cant to the bursting out is that visualization of the horror, which means this was the horror that he was experiencing internally. And the reason I'm mentioning this is that the other thing that strikes me, I think that these other 2 points, we'll see that at a certain point, we're reading through chapter 27, but the transition from up to chapter 27, we have the cycles of arguments. But the cycle of arguments don't have any end. At a certain point, those arguments just don't work anymore, and there's a new discourse in chapter 28, which we'll talk about next time. And it becomes a totally different discourse that you just can't get your head around life. And it's not like that the rational discourse just sort of fades away, the same way the ritual fades away. And then we'll see with the divine speeches, at a certain point, a change takes place, and there's a kind of inner psychic transformation that's going on. So notice, by the way, the fullness of his psychic pain. If the positive side was that the more ritual I do obsessively will keep my world in order, or keeps the world in order, so why should the world be screwy if I'm a ritualist up to the kazoo? Then if disaster strikes, it's very interesting that his language is the unmaking of the world. His very language is, I wish I wasn't born. I wish the sun didn't come out. I wish the moon didn't come out. I wish my mother's womb didn't work like a womb, that the womb was a tomb, right? That the day didn't have light, that the day would have been darkness. And if you look through all that language, you can see that that this day was not numbered among the days of the year, right? His language is to undo the creation, right? Because the creation has been undone in him psychologically. This type of ritual statement what's interesting here is, stylistically, there's a difference between the liturgical assertions that he made before and what a lament is, right? The lament of chapter 3 is a different literary form, isn't it? And in a certain sense, it's the unmaking of existence through language. That his lament is to unmake himself, wishing that he had died. Curse of the odore yom, tidim, all the things that the stars shouldn't have come out. There shouldn't be light. Yikav la'or va'ayin, right? That the afape shachar, the eyelids of the dawn should never have opened up. It's an incredible image, right? Like the world, when dawn happens, the divine eyes open up and the light comes through in this world. And if God's eyes close, there's darkness and there's no world. incredible metaphorical anthropomorphization of what it means to an existence through the notion of eyesight, right? The eyes of dawn are kind of the eyes of light and existence and so on. And then he says, so then, because then the verse 11 is the counterpoint to this issue of referring to coming from the womb of his mother in verse 21 of chapter 2, 21. Now in chapter 3, 11, let me just say this, then I see your question. Lama is another kind of a question. Right? Lama lo merechem amut. Why didn't I die from the womb? Right? And that I would have come forth and died. Lama. Then madua. Why did the knees of my mother receive me? The birthing knees. Right? Uma shadayim. Why should there have been even nipples for my sucking? In other words, he did not. There's this powerful lament that wants to end the light of life and then to be unmothered, right? Like now, the world now takes the shape of the maternal, the mother. Everything is unnatural, the closing of the womb, the knees that won't receive the birth body, right? The breasts. Why? So this is part of his rhetorical question. For then I just would have had peace and rest. Yashanti az yanuach li. In other words, if I wasn't, it's obviously it's a paradox. If I wasn't born, I would have rest. I would not have psychic pain, right? And then nothing. And then the next time, then I want to hear your responses, that we have that lama appear again as a question that's pushing our understanding of the text forward is verse 20. It's not just, so now he moves, but this is an interesting move. In the Hebrew, lama yitain la'amel or. Why should light even dawn on a daily worker? Right? B'chayim l'marei nefesh. And why are people even born? Because life is a bitterness. Hamechakim lamavet veinenu. They're born and their whole life they're waiting to die. And it doesn't come. Because life is one damn thing after another. It's a horror. Right? He says, Vayach beruhu matmoni. So what's interesting through these questions is that the first question wants to be unmothered so that he would have been stillborn. There would not have been life. That's how painful this is. And then he widens the scope. The scope is no longer me, Job, who's experienced this, but life itself is a horror. Right? The light of life for the daily worker is filled with horror and pain. And there's this death. There's this death dimension that doesn't come fast enough. That the light that everyone sees every day is just another daily horror of this. So why? So he's and now look, because he's widening the net from his own private existential experience to himself being a metonym or symbolic of the entire existence. And here we have this powerful existential statement that appears, let me translate it, and I'm curious how the translators deal with it. On verse 23, I think it's an astonishing statement. Legever asher darko nistara vayasech Eloah ba'ado. Why is life this horror? It's not just the striving for achievement and it never comes, the striving for anything, but you live in this absolute hiddenness of meaning. Why? Because God it's ontological. God has covered this person with the ignorance of any sense, of any meaning. Now there's this interesting, this is part of the Lama question. Why? Right? Why is there? Why should it do this? Why should it even happen for a person whose way in life, the way of human existence is nistara. It is ontologically concealed even from the deepest sense of the self. And why? This is God's doing, right? God has put this cloak of ignorance or incapacity to conceive. So he's raising this deep, deep question, and he says, and now one more thing, then we'll I want to hear your question.
But that's your reading of the word derech, of the word way, as meaning. It's not the pshat of this.
Well, what do you think it means? What is the
Several ways.
What?
Several ways.
So what would you say? So Maxim doesn't agree. So what do you say?
No, I didn't say that I didn't agree. I said that it is your modern understanding.
Well, what could the darko of a person mean? His way of existence, huh?
Maybe his future, where his life is going to.
Okay, but that would all be. But then we're still in agreement. In other words, any sense of what human life or destiny or path is totally obscure. In other words, I just have from moment to moment life mortals, these things, and I want to die. I just have the fragments, but any sense of everything else is cut off. And then we now have the psychologically this pièce de résistance, right? Because if you ask yourself the question, why was he doing what he was doing for his kids? And now he tells us. He tells us once he allows himself to be in touch with himself. Ki fachad pacharti vayet hayim. I had anxiety about this all along, and now it's come upon me. I don't know how do your translations do this? Verse 20. Try va'asher yagorti yahu. What I really was afraid of, that the world was filled with terror and brokenness. Now I see that's the reality. In other words, I had constructed the world around my ritual actions to live within that liturgical bubble. And now the anxiety of real existence has forced itself up into my consciousness. That's the most astonishing issue that's propelling the death wish and the desire that all human beings, because now he brings that back to the personal in this astonishing manner. Yes?
I was thinking, it's interesting that, I don't know if this is a translation question, but earlier when there's the conversation with Satan, and Satan is saying to God, why have you just sort of fenced him in? And the sense there seems to be that you sort of protected him and kept him safe in this really artificial way.
Nice.
And here this is the same, at least in this translation, which
Vayasech, right? Nice, very nice.
It's the same image of being fenced in, and it seems like he's suddenly becoming, or maybe he's in some way becoming aware of being fenced in and being sort of having reality hidden from him. And now he's kind of seeing reality.
Yeah, I think. Let me just make just a point out. Where is the phrase "v'sachta ba'ado"?
Is here 3?
No. Before that, chapter 1, verse 10. So, the Satan says to him, Job is pious, right? Halo ata sachta ba'ado va'ad beito, right? You have protected him. You've given him this protective covering. And now that same verb is used ironically at the end to say that God has introduced into the structure of the human mind a fundamental, not just ignorance, but a structure of mind that can't see things clearly. Right? And everything is, in other words, we might say, it's not the fog of war, it's the ontological fog.
But aren't we reading too much into this? Because it's obvious.
You're saying that?
No, I mean, I was going to ask this question because it's exactly the same verb, and it's obvious that this is a response to chapter 110.
That's what I'm saying. That's what I just
Yes,
said.
but the issue here is not epistemological blindness or something. It's very simply, I think, a response to 110 and taking care of Job in this life and avoiding suffering. The issue here is, I think,
So what does it mean? How would you play off these two passages that we...
simply, why isn't God protecting me? It's not very, I don't see
You
how
read that
can
one? You read it?
you can't justify, I mean, it's interesting to interpret.
But yeah,
it,
isn't he
you can't
making a
justify-
larger ontological claim? The ontological claim is, Satan's claim was the ontology of human ritual piety is because they don't have to deal with the horrors of life, right? Right? And now he's saying this, the horrors of life are part of the ontological fog, and you can't. He's not only protected by God from the experience of randomness, but his whole mind is moving in these realms of concealment that is far deeper ontologically, right?
It's interesting, but again, I think it's a fallacy of equivocation to use the same verb in two different. This is pretty much straightforward the way it's used in 110.
Right, I agree.
But it's interesting, but just.
Rachel wants to come back.
The only reason I would be inclined to push back is because
You're trying to what? Push back?
Yeah,
you
being
gotta push
inclined to
back,
push
okay.
back is because while you do not, like, you would get a univocal reading of Ba'ado, which would be nice if you, interpreted it your way, then the sense of Darho would have to be like someone's like material well-being, which I don't know if there's precedent for that. You'd have to
we don't
favor-
know what derech would be in this case. I think just to supplement Maxim's notion, in many places, let's say in the book of Exodus, where Moses wants to know the derech of God, he wants to know God's providential way.
Right.
So it could be one's life or the providential plan of how things go. It could be multi-dimensional.
Either way, though, it seems to be like not referring to something material exclusively, though. No.
I agree. Yeah.
I can.
Yeah.
Short question. Very short. I don't have dictionaries in my head any longer.
You're getting older too? Oh, too bad.
One is samach and one is shin, but the verbs are definitely related.
Oh, I think that these are it's the same.
Could I make? I want to connect between Betty and the comment between 110 and 3:23.
Okay.
So through the Ibn Ezra, who brings together both Sachta, which would mean thrones. So
What do you mean?
Kutzim,
Thorns, right?
thorns,
Right.
and basically that God protected. He said that God protected Job from the outside by means of Kutzim, which brings both interpretations. Like he kind of connects both interpretations,
Sure.
which basically through ignorance, through Kutzim, basically, he was protected from the world itself. So it's kind of both. It's both kind of protecting and guarding, but the guarding itself, protecting itself, is the means of.
Interesting.
Is that what the writer meant, though, or is
That's Ibn Ezra.
Well, it's
and
Ibn
then
Ezra.
he
He's working with the same problem that we have,
He
right?
refers to Bamidbar and to Shaya.
Look, Ibn Ezra, he's trying to make sense. Okay, so Rachel, do you want to give a quick look?
No,
we have a real medievalist here.
No, I'm just curious.
Okay. But what we're seeing is that the Ibn Ezra is trying to make a correlation. The same. So we have a different reading. How do you correlate these? that the question was raised of what is this hedging about? Is it positive, negative? Is it an ontological thing? Is it an act of good divine providence? The accusation of the Satan, of the Satan, is that this, you look, God, you've got this big ego trip. No one's like my little pal Joe, right? He runs along with me on a short leash. He's a good little guy. And then the Satan comes back and says, "Big deal, you're proud of this? You've kept him in this little doghouse this whole life. So how do you say? Of course he's going to be Fido. He's very faithful, right?"
Which in turn questions the cause and effect of his wife. That is her fundamental assumption, that if you do good, you will get good, and if you do bad, you will get bad. And she's questioning the whole thing. But we see that in the first place, at least from the view of Satan, that hasn't been the case anyway.
What do you mean it hasn't been the case?
As in, it's not cause and effect. God has protected Job. It's not that he has done good.
Because they're working on the notion of how do you get at the notion of gratuitous loyalty? By having gratuitous horror.
What's indifferent?
That's the challenge. Did you want? No.
But I think we're overlooking what I think is the most interesting question is.
Well, of course. Right?
We all know the critical text.
What?
Why isn't he committing suicide? I mean, it automatically.
Why should a person commit suicide?
I'm thinking,
Why
for example, of Saul in the Bible.
Right.
The only parallel case of something going so terribly wrong, and I think I'm trying to think of.
But it was not a case of shame.
Okay.
Saul has he's been personally unmanned. Right? Everything has the promises. He's been shamed publicly.
Yeah, but I mean, suffering is
Even when he says to Samuel, he says, "Well, maybe there was a problem the way I dealt with the spoils of war, but let's just walk back in public and let it look good, like he's still with me, I'm still the king, everything is good, because otherwise they're all going to laugh at me."
Yeah, but I mean, I think
he's worried about the social consequences.
But I'm talking about something else. You have two extreme cases of suffering in the Bible. These are probably the most extreme cases of suffering, and in one of those you have suicide, and in the other one you have a very curious case of complaining about existence over and over again without actually doing anything about it. I mean, he's talking as if he's forced to stay alive by some.
By the condition of chapter.
By some godly power.
All right. So if we I think there is from a literary hermeneutic point of view I would offer the following answer. The search for meaning is what keeps him alive. This endless attempt to figure it out, or to understand his pain, or in other words, to find this is from the deep structure of this book, the animating feature, right? Everything with the Book of Job from the very beginning was an attempt to figure out subjectivity, to figure out emotion, to figure out motive, to figure out meaning, how things are working. And the whole book becomes this journey into the validity of explanation.
But if that is the case, it would make this the beginning of chapter 3 sort of rhetorical more than anything else, because he doesn't really want to die, and he's not really that.
He's wishing
But
There's something very conflicting there.
look, maybe it's taking us off to the side, but you've come back to this several times. Suicide is not necessarily an option for people. People people want to live, but he's expressing a death wish because of pain. But he's taking it back in how do you stop psychic pain? You wish you weren't born. He's not can't take kind of drugs to numb his mind. He's this is the case of the person who's trying to deal with the unexplainable, and that's the whole structure of the book, right? There isn't suicide from Saul's point of view is a radical ending, right? Here, you're right. Job's statement it's rhetorical. Why didn't I die from that? In other words, it opens the question of what's going on. I mean, it's the pain of existence is what's now being articulated here, both in Jobin and then in universal terms. Yeah.
I think, from the point of view of narrative, I think it's quite simple if you turn back to 2, 4, 5, 6. I mean, so basically, it's ultimately the entire term of this different point of view of narrative to examine the extremes within life itself, and it's an explicit key condition that examine. I mean, take him to the outermost extreme, but do not touch. Do not take his life. Do not bring him to a point where he considers the thing of do not bring him to the point of death itself. I mean,
Rather,
bring him.
I mean, always bring him to the very edge, but always make sure that his achet nefsho shemo.
Yeah.
Always
So is a book. No, but so that is the book is bringing you to the edge, so that we see how you speak out of pain. What is that language? So we have about 10, 12 minutes. I want to just make a couple of other points. I think we have to continue. Next time, let's go, we'll be a little bit more topical through chapter 10. I want to pick up on a couple of things, then we'll jump to 28. Well, yeah, I want to pick up, that's what I was planning to do today, but I didn't get there. And then we're going to do 28. We'll go as far as we can, and we may have to spill over. And so I want to just... Yeah, but then also 28, and keep reading. So I want to just make a couple of points, just so that we at least move into the discussion, the debates with the friends, right? So notice how Eliphaz begins. He begins with this kind of rhetorical question, right? Can I butt in here? Will you let me have a word edgewise, right? Can you shut up long enough for me to get a word in? So in other words, this is the question that he's raising is that as long as you keep going on, Job, you're going to be in the framework of this whole lament narrative that is also closing you off from further thinking. So the new question is, can you shut your mouth long enough for the space of my language to emerge? Right? So it's a question that is forcing a new entry point, and it becomes the entry point of the challenge of rationalities, right? The challenge of rationalities is that Job is presenting what he's presenting, and Eliphaz doesn't simply wait till he finishes. In a certain sense, he wants to come in, and the way he comes in is to challenge Job's very structure of consciousness. And he does that with another question. It's part of this question. Can I butt in here? Do you mind if I say something? Will you let me speak? And then he says, you look what the situation is. You comforted many people, right? You supported many people. You raised them up. You did all of this. But notice the pun here. Ki ata tavo elecha vateled. It's against verse 2. And he said, can I raise something to you till air? Will you permit this? And then he says, but when things happen to you, when it hits the fan, you just fall apart. In other words, you were good in talking about strengthening and giving support and understanding sympathetically issue, but when it happens to you, you are totally undone. Tiga adecha vati bahel. This is a key verse. You're in a state of total confusion. In other words, you're not able. The question that the interlocutor is raising is that in the pain of the personal pain, you're no longer able to act the self that you were when you were. In other words, you were able to give comfort when you didn't have pain. But you can't give yourself comfort when it happens to you. Right? That's the interesting question, that there's a psychic strength towards the other that he's accusing him of not having the same emotional strength when it comes to himself. And now he then raises, I'm not even sure how to translate this verse 6, because I think that the narrator intended an ironic pun. It's on what the word kislatecha means, whether it means your folly or your strength. It can mean both in biblical Hebrew, right? So on one reading, your yirah, your reverence for God, it's a question, right? It's a rhetorical question. He's trying to now stick it to Job, who could not deal with himself the way he could. He wasn't a self-soother, let us say. He couldn't use the same arguments towards himself. And halo yiratecha kislatecha tikvatecha v'tom dirachecha. Here's the play on the word tom and tom. So what does that mean? You could read it two ways. One way. Is not the yirah that you have had your own folly and undoing? You had yirah, but for all kinds of things that made you a real good helper for everybody, and it is your folly, it's your undoing. It doesn't, and everything that you hoped for, and the perfection of your derech, of your way, means nothing. Or you could say, and it's a legitimate possibility, your yirah is your strength. Why? Because he says, verse 7.
Exactly.
Right. Look now, he says, mihu, it's a question. Mihu naki avad. Has any innocent person really been wiped out? And where is Yesharim? Though this is who he is, a Yashar. And what kind of innocent persons are cut off? In other words, your yirah is your strength because you are alive, you're not dead. So that is a sign that God is just and he doesn't cut off the innocent. Right? So he has it both ways through the question that gets at the deepest perplexity of what Job is thinking. If you ask it the first way, on the basis of the thing that preceded, like you could help other people but you can't help yourself, then the statement then becomes your religious piety is just a big joke. Right? It's just kislatech. You're a fool. You've exposed the folly of your religious piety because you can't do anything with it when the stuff hits the fan. When life hits the fan and you're covered over with life, you can't do anything. So your yirah is just a big pile of crap. It's kessel. right? Or, from the other side, which seems legitimately true, your yira is your strength, because you believe that there is some kind of integrity to action, and that actions have consequences, and you are alive, right? And you didn't die. Now, how is Job, right? So he's caught on the horns because we don't know how the narrator intended it, and so we as readers are brought into a double bind by the ambiguity of the question. So here we don't know how Job heard Eliphaz, but we know that we have to hear it as an ambiguous statement. And the ambiguity of it is the real perplexity. Now, he adds one further thing, and then with this, we'll just stop for now. Well, let me just make this, and then we'll have a couple of questions towards the end. He goes on and he says, and this is really probably the only time in the book of Job where we have an actual revelation within the text. So he said, I had a dream, and in the dream, right, I had a horrifying dream, right? Pachad kra'ani radai. It was a real, I had an anxiety dream, right? And my hair stood on end, and I had bumps on my skin, and I had tremors. So he says that. He knows what an anxiety dream is, right? And I had a vision. Tamuna leneged einai. Something occurred to me. Demama v'kol ishma. Right? He's playing on the language that appears with Elijah. Right? Right? There's out of some kind of primordial silence, I heard a communication. Right? And what did I hear? It's a rhetorical question. Ha'enosh me'elo yitzdak. Can a person be justified before God? Im me'osehu yitzdak. Can a person be more pure than his creator? God doesn't even trust his angels. They're also stained, he says, right? So how much the more so a human being of flesh and blood? In other words, he has changed the whole notion. A human being who is cut off and broken from morning to night, and who has no hope. In other words, the structure of the self is frail. And so your very notion that you could assume that there could not be some form of potential justification for your suffering is an act of absolute hubris, right? So he gets it on the one hand, he wants him to realize that your own piety is proved insufficient, and your own presumption of absolute innocence is a hubris. In other words, if he's trying to get at what is it, if you really understand what it means to be a creature of flesh and blood, the hubris is to understand God and say that I did nothing. You're assuming that there's no complicated motivation, even that the motivation is everything that is pure, right? So he's trying to get Job from two angles. That Job hasn't lived up to his own highest ideals, or if he has, he doesn't realize that his very life is a sign that he is at some level innocent, and if he is suffering at least psychically, but he's alive, well, is there any person who's so pure that they don't deserve some form of emotional pain? And then verse 7, the human being has been born to horror. He's picking up on Job's own language. So he said, so what's the alternative? Just, you have to turn to God's absolute power accept these consequences and going forward. And then he ends in verse 27. There aren't any questions here that I want to pick up on. He says, Hine zot chakanuha kenhu shema'ena v'ata da'alach. Verse 27. He said, what we can rely on is tradition and traditional explanations. In other words, I not only have experienced this in my own consciousness, that no person can be pure, but we have a tradition. And for you to take your stand outside of tradition and for the sake of hubris and total knowledge is an act of absolute folly. So he says, I re-embed myself in divine power and the notion of frailty and sin. So maybe we'll stop with that, because I have to break now. But what we'll pick up next time is I want to spend like the first half hour, go over a couple of sections between up through chapter 10, because it adds a few more interesting wrinkles to the structure of argumentation. In other words, think of these debates as the structure of justification. What gives life coherence? And how do the questions drive the notion of plausibility? They each are trying to deal with the problem of plausibility so they can move on. And then there'll be a radical shift with chapter 28, and hopefully we'll be able to move towards the end as well. All right, so maybe we'll break here. Maxime has a question, and I think if you check the syllabus, you'll see about the questions and things like that. And so, those people who wanted to be in touch with me tomorrow, send me an email, and after I see Sam, I will answer you tonight around 11 or so, 10 or 11. Okay? Okay, thanks.
A minor objection is that in 4:6, the word castle is parallel to the word qua.
That's your hope.
The whole engine of his speech in chapter 5, the hope is very central.
I agree. So that would be that would be the reading. Your hope because you haven't and you should have confidence.
So I could only read in the second way you offered it. That castle here is hope.
I agree. Can I have your